One officer insists William can't film because the police station is private property, but that skips over a key point. News Now Yorkshire highlights that private land doesn't prevent someone from filming it while standing in a public space. That distinction is fundamental, and once it's ignored, the argument starts to unravel. That Will.i.am then introduces something far more concrete. A letter from the chief constable confirming that members of the public are allowed to film police stations from publicly accessible areas. It's clear guidance, designed to avoid exactly this kind of confusion. Yet instead of engaging with it, the sergeant dismisses it outright, without addressing the fact that it reflects her own force's position. That disconnect exposes a gap between policy and practice. With that point left unaddressed, the tone shifts again. The conversation moves away from explanation and toward suggestion of enforcement, with hints of arrest entering the exchange. The request to point the phone elsewhere, paired with the claim that the station isn't a public place, doesn't resolve the issue. It sidesteps the central question, where William is standing, and what he's lawfully entitled to do from that position. At that stage, the interaction is no longer grounded in clear reasoning. It becomes less about applying known rules and more about asserting control, even as the foundation for doing so continues to weaken. When asked what action she would actually take, the sergeant answers that it depends on what William does next. News Now Yorkshire highlights why that response matters. It shows a shift toward hypothetical reasoning. Police powers aren't built on what might happen. They require a clear, present basis, something specific and identifiable at the time, not a warning based on future possibilities. The situation then escalates further with a threat to seize his phone. That step carries serious weight, yet it's introduced without any clear legal grounding. What makes it more concerning is her statement that she doesn't need to quote legislation. In reality, understanding and being able to explain the legal basis for using such powers isn't optional. It's fundamental, especially for someone in a supervisory role. Threatening arrest or seizure without identifying the authority behind it exposes a deeper issue. It suggests enforcement is being driven by assertion rather than by clearly defined powers. The repeated claim that this is not a public place also goes unaddressed in any meaningful way, leaving the core question unresolved. At that point, the interaction moves away from lawful explanation and into uncertainty. When authority is exercised without a clear understanding or communication of its limits, it raises serious questions about how those powers are being applied in practice. When William asks a straightforward question, whether any bylaws actually prevent him from filming, the sergeant talks over him instead of giving an answer. News Now Yorkshire shows how that avoidance is telling. If such a bylaw existed, it would take seconds to name it. The fact that it isn't identified, despite repeated opportunities, suggests there's no clear legal basis being relied on. Instead of addressing the point, she continues to challenge him while sidestepping the question. The interaction then takes another turn when William is accused of wasting police time. That claim doesn't align with what's happening. Officers initiated the contact and chose to continue it, even after it became apparent that no offense had been identified. Complaining about being busy while prolonging a situation they created only adds to the contradiction. Rather than stepping back once it's clear there's no unlawful activity, the response is to double down and shift the focus onto him. That shift moves away from objective assessment and into blame, revealing not just weak reasoning but questionable judgment from someone expected to lead the situation. The tone takes a sharper turn when they suggest that if the footage appears on social media, he'll be tracked down, spoken to, and even arrested. News Now Yorkshire highlights how that kind of statement sounds less like a lawful warning and more like a reaction driven by frustration. It introduces consequences without clearly linking them to any defined offense. They then focus on William photographing vehicles in the police car park, not because it breaks a rule, but because they don't like it. That distinction matters. Personal discomfort doesn't create a legal restriction. Even after acknowledging there's no specific law preventing him, they still try to direct him to stop recording. That makes it clear the issue isn't legality, it's preference. The warning about tracking him down if footage is posted adds another layer of concern. It shifts the interaction away from objective enforcement and towards something that feels personal. Referencing officer safety without showing a direct, evidence-based risk doesn't automatically justify restricting lawful activity at that stage. The interaction moves beyond applying the law and into attempting to control behavior without a clear foundation. When authority is used in that way, based on discomfort rather than defined powers, it raises serious questions about how those decisions are being made. When William asks where she got the idea that filming private land isn't allowed, the sergeant admits she can't say. News Now Yorkshire shows how that admission immediately weakens her position. If someone is being directed to stop what appears to be lawful activity, the source of that authority should be clear and identifiable, not something vague or unknown. Without being able to point to a rule, policy, or law, the instruction loses its foundation. It highlights that the claim isn't built on something concrete, but on assumption. In situations like this, clarity matters, and the absence of it raises serious questions about the basis for the direction being given. The situation becomes even more concerning when William asks to see the other officer's warrant card and is refused. The sergeant states he can only see it if he's being searched, which doesn't align with standard expectations. Officers are generally required to identify themselves when asked, especially during an interaction they have initiated. Refusing to provide identification in that context shifts the dynamic further. It moves away from transparency and accountability, reinforcing the impression that authority is being asserted without the openness that should accompany it. The suggestion of issuing a direction to leave hints at dispersal powers, but those aren't available without meeting a clear threshold. News Now Yorkshire shows that under the Antisocial Behavior, Crime and Policing Act 2014, such powers require behavior likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress. Quietly filming from a public area, with no complaints and no disruption, doesn't meet that standard. Without those elements, the suggestion feels misplaced rather than grounded in law. The situation becomes even more confused when the sergeant claims William could be committing an offense by wasting police time. That's not accurate. Section 5 of the Criminal Law Act 1967 applies to knowingly making a false report, not simply being present or engaging in lawful activity. Mixing up those two scenarios highlights a misunderstanding of how the law is meant to be applied. Hearing these points raised with confidence, especially at supervisory level, raises broader concerns. When significant powers are discussed without a clear grasp of their meaning or limits, it undermines the reliability of the interaction. It's not just about one moment. It reflects how easily authority can be asserted without a solid legal foundation. This ties into a wider issue. Understanding how these powers actually work is becoming increasingly important, especially as legal frameworks evolve and enforcement becomes more active. Situations like this show how quickly things can escalate when there's a gap between what's assumed and what's legally accurate. If you found value in this breakdown, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to support the channel and keep these discussions in focus. I'm the Audit Assessor. This was episode 18. See you next time.